live here with another episode of Secret Societies with War Hamster Brady, and I'm Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins. So how are you doing today, Brady?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
I'm awesome.
Very good. Well, you are awesome. We got some fun.
I play grandma more and more these days, so I love it.
Yeah, we're getting ready to take a trip out to see the nieces and nephews, so that should be, I get it.
And then you get to come home.
Oh, we got so much travel this year. Let's jump in.
All right. I'm ready. What do you got for us today?
Well, we left off last week talking about the wonderful Bundy family, and they were a lot of fun. Today, we're going to pick back up around Skull and Bones, again, going chronologically. Starting around 1909, we'll do a couple of quick people that I think are significant. And we spend most of the time talking about the wonderful Harriman family. And I think that'll take
a good way to wrap it up.
What's that?
I said that'd be a great way to wrap it up.
Yeah, well, that's going to be the bulk of the show. I mean, we can go on. We could do like Harrimans are.
Yes.
Oh, they've been all over the place, to say the least. Let's see. Should we give? Well, for those who have not, we're just joining this episode, this series. We started talking about secret societies and started with a theory that the secret society that matters the most is Skull and Bones. And people argue that Skull and Bones, just like any other group of people with similar interests, similar families, very wealthy families, they're going to socialize with each other. They're going to do business with each other, and that's all it is. Counter theory, which we're trying to prove one way or the other, is that this secret society happens to have their finger on the pulse of every single thing that happens in the United States and the world. Yes. Making that case, we've just gone through chronologically a whole bunch of the Skull and Bones members and members of the Order, which is also called. We've seen them in every major office in America dealing with foreign policy and domestic, from presidents to Supreme Court justices, a lot of secretaries of state, a lot of military, absolutely the founding people of our intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, you name it, these people are involved. And families, you just go through chronologically and look at the connections, and it's pretty hard not to draw a certain conclusion.
Well, and the point you made earlier was statistical. They're statistically way overrepresented in everything you just named.
Yeah, very much so. It's we don't believe in coincidences at a certain point, I guess.
The fact that you would find someone that graduated from these prestigious universities in any one of those professions is not unusual. The fact that you would find so many, not just from the institution itself, but from a secret society within the institution.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, Skull and Bones comes from Yale University, founded in the 1830s. They take 15 juniors every year, tap them, that's what it's called. They go through all kinds of some kind of secret ritual that people have speculated about, the occult nature of that. We haven't gotten into that because it's not really either one of our areas of expertise. But once they get into serve 1 year in Skull and Bones, and somehow the doors to the corridors of power seem to open for them.
Correct.
And it's more than just general networking. So our first Bonesman today, we'll do a quick look at, is a guy by the name of Albert De Silver from 1909. There's no real records for his ancestry or where his wealth came from, but he did have some money. Why is he important? Well, he graduates Yale undergrad and goes to Columbia Law, which is a diversion because most of these guys go straight from Yale undergrad to Harvard Law. He's worth talking about because he was actually the co-founder of what's called the National Civil Liberties Bureau, which is now called the ACLU. And interesting guy. The ACLU was founded to defend war objectors after the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. He's basically spent his life trying to defend these people so we couldn't prosecute people that, imagine the 1960s Vietnam War protesters. Same thing happened in World War I. So he's kind of a real break from the normal neocon, neoliberal Skull and Bones members. This guy was against, kind of stuck up at the little guy. So I thought he was worth mentioning.
Well, and that goes back to my, you have to have both sides in order to go down the middle.
Theory. Yeah, Hegelian dialectic.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about that just about every week, so I don't think we need to go too deep into that right now. Here's another quick one for you. Guy by the name of George Leslie Harrison. Now, we've had other Harrisons in the Bonesman, but I can't find a record that he's related to any of the other ones. But you know how these people are with their last names.
Yes.
So, what's interesting about him? Quite a few things. Well, goes to Yale undergrad, Harvard Law, Bonesman's class of 1910. So a lot of these guys we're going to talk about, they were just getting out of college right when World War I started, and ended up in really prominent positions. But this guy, what did he do? Well, first of all, he gets a job clerking for Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. So that's the second Bonesman who's been a clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes. He would do that for 1 year, and then he would become a general counsel. This guy just got out of law school like in 1914, 15, and he becomes the general counsel for the Federal Reserve Board, which had just been founded in 1913. Pretty young to have that kind of position.
Very young.
Yeah. From there, it's where he gets fun. Remember this name, George Leslie Harrison. He became the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1928 to 1941. Of all the member banks of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Bank of New York is the most important by far because they regulate all the Wall Street banks. This is the guy who persuaded the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to try to avoid the overvaluation of the stock market. They tried to raise interest rates to pop the bubble instead of letting a market react naturally. Months later, we got the great stock market crash of 1929, which basically started the Great Depression and led to World War II.
Imagine that, a Bonesman.
So he gets better. You got to look at what really caused the crash, and put my economics hat on. We had overproduction in this country, which led to falling prices, supply demand. We had way too much speculation using borrowed money in the stock markets. Everybody was participating, much worse than the dot-com era, where one of the biggest investment manias we've ever seen. We had a weakened banking system with terrible lending practices. You had a lot of international economic factors coming from the World War I, reparations and debts, and we had some really lousy policies. But the one trigger that did it was raising interest rates into the face of a stock market, and just blew it all up. So if you want to point the stock market crash on one person, it's George Leslie Harrison.
Isn't that funny? And you don't ever even hear his name.
No, a lot of these names disappear from. We're not taught them in school. Even if those of us who went to schools and studied a lot of history and economics, some of these names just don't show up in the books.
And I like the fact that this one. Are you going to talk about him working actually being in charge of the New York Life Insurance Company?
That's next to 1941. He becomes president of New York Life Insurance. Now, why did you know that?
Well, because that had to do with how FDR came up back in the day. FDR, most people don't realize, was very heavy into the insurance, and the New York Life Insurance Company, when Anthony Sutton was charting out who all of the players were in funding the Bolshevik Revolution and Hitler, kept coming up.
Yeah, New York Life is still around to this day, and they own quite a bit of the Manhattan skyline, to be honest with you. So he left the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to do that endeavor, and it was not a step down. So then we come up with 1941, what's going on besides a world war. And so he gets himself assigned as working for a guy by the name of Stimson, fellow Bonesman.
We talked about him already.
Yep. So he was a special assistant to Simpson on matters relating to the development of the atomic bomb.
And can I explain to everybody what a special assistant is? It's a made-up job. So in the military, you have an organizational chart. Just as a key research tool, anytime you see the word special assistant, that means that they brought him in. He doesn't actually have a real job. He is going to be doing something that is not part of the real job of that organization, and he's going to be the point man for it. Because when he disappears, because that position didn't exist, it's as if he was never there. Very, very important.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about this particular position is obviously he's qualified to work on the development of the atomic bomb because he's been a banker and a lawyer.
And it's really I keep coming back to the whole Manhattan Project, right? Because the Batil company that we exposed on Alpha Warrior Show last Wednesday, the guy that created that company was intimately involved in that, in the Manhattan Project. So it is very important to have a banker in that because they needed money to do it.
Yeah, I guess the government slush fund wasn't enough. He's also the guy who informed Stimson of the successful A-bomb test in New Mexico. And it's a pretty interesting quote with a code. They have the exact quote of what he sent to Stimson. It says, "Doctor has just returned most enthusiastic and confident that the little boy is as husky as his big brother. The light in his eyes discernible from here to high hold, and I could have heard his screams from here to my farm."
And why is that important? Does anybody recognize why he said that? Because the name of the bomb was Little Boy.
Mm-hmm. That was code word. It was a transatlantic cable. And yeah. And it was not prearranged. It was just his own little wit. But I think he was worth mentioning in this series. Guy crashed the stock market, helped the A-bomb. Oh, well. Anything else on him? Do you have?
No, that's it.
All right, so here's another guy, class of 1913. So a few years later, by the name of Alfred Cowles III. He never called himself the third, but he was. His father and grandfather were both Yale grads. Neither one was his Bonesman. They were both executives with the Chicago Tribune newspaper. That's where that family money came from. I bring him up because he's also an econometrics guy, just like we talked about with Fisher last week or the week before. He's an economist. Strangely enough, Cowles pulled all of his own money out of the stock market just weeks prior to the crash of 1929.
Imagine that. Like they knew what was going to happen by doing those stupid things.
Just good timing, I think. Why else is he important? Well, he was the founder of something called the Cowles Commission. K-O-W-L-E-S is Cowles. It's hard to say. They had the Cowles Commission for the Research of Economics in 1932. He actually worked with Irving Fisher to launch something called Econometrica. What he tried to do was make economics more of a science by collecting data and applying math and statistical techniques to basically figure out the markets. They used something called the Hollerith punch card machine to research what's called a correlation coefficient, something I do in Excel every single day, or I used to. But they had this, this is the first real computer. Hollerith Punch Card Company would change their name later on to be something called IBM.
Yeah, when I first joined the Air Force, our personnel system was done with punch cards.
Yeah. We've seen these in film. These old computers would fill up, a gymnasium, and everything was done with these punch cards. It's like an old-fashioned Scantron. Just punch holes. That's all the computer could read. And this guy would also go on to write what's called a monograph on the effects of atomic energy on the economy. So bright guy, but a couple interesting connections with him.
Wait a minute. He would write what?
A monograph, or just a treatise, on the effects of atomic energy on the economy.
So the guy we just talked about is involved in that. It's almost like it's a thing, right?
I thought it was worth mentioning. There most certainly can be a connection to the two.
Well, I think there's a connection to the entire... because, of course, you can't lose sight of the fact that the whole paperclip, and the importing of all of these scientists, and how big of a role that the Bushes end up playing in that whole thing. Yeah, I believe it's all related. But anyway, go ahead.
That's pretty much all I had for him. I think those are fun connections as we're going through chronologically.
Alrighty.
All right. Well, the next big name we have in 1913 was a guy by the name of William Averill Harriman, also known as Avery Harriman. Skull and Bones class of 1913. His younger brother, they were two of 6 children of E.H. Harriman. And you can't talk about the Harrimans unless we start with E.H., I think, because he is important. Not a household name, is he?
No.
E.H. Harriman. When you think robber barons, you think about who? Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. But E.H. Harriman's name doesn't come up on the average person's tongue, which is really unusual because he should. So hang on a second. I got a picture of E.H. Harriman. Let me just share the screen. Here is Mr. E.H. Harriman. And you see him next to a train. Well, there's a reason for that. I gotta get glasses like that. It's a good look. Okay. Why is Harriman so important? What do we know about him? Okay, he's born in Hempstead, New York. He had a great-grandfather, William, who emigrated from England in 1795, who's a successful businessman and trader. His father, Orlando Harriman Sr., was an Episcopal clergyman. Now, why is that important? Well, we've just talked about how so many of the Skull and Bones have to do with, they went to the clergy as well. That's another one of the areas of society that they just emanate from. So that's where he came from. E.H. Harriman quits school at the age of 14, so he didn't make it to Yale. Takes a job as a Wall Street errand boy, and by 22, he's become a member of the New York Stock Exchange. Okay. He marries a woman named Mary Williamson Averill. That's where Averill Harriman got his name from. Again, mother's maiden name becomes your middle name. That's why that way when you announce yourself in society, they know that both lines of
you're connected to.
Yeah, it's like a business card.
Yeah.
They would go on to have 6 kids, 5 of which lived to adulthood. The only 2 we're going to talk about were the Bonesmen. The other ones didn't do anything too spectacular. But Mary Williamson Averill's father, his father-in-law, was the president of something called the Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain Railroad Company. So by 1881, at the age of 33, he buys his first railroad. There's a broken down Lake Ontario Southern Railroad, and he would build it back up and sell it to Pennsylvania Railroad at a huge profit. So now he realizes the potential of making, turning broken down railroads into profitable ones, and he becomes the railroad robber baron. I mean, this is the guy. He's really the guy who coordinated all of the robber barons getting involved in the railroad. And what he did is the Rothschilds family, who were at the peak of their powers in Europe, their main agent in America was, of course, Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff, of course, would be part of founding the Federal Reserve a few decades later. He pitches Jacob Schiff on the idea of getting a bunch of rich people to pool their money together and build a national network of railroads. And among those investors were Rockefeller, J.D. Rockefeller, Carnegie himself, J.P. Morgan, and a guy by the name of James Jerome Hill. And that's how these railroad fortunes just exploded, is with Rothschild and Schiff money, but also backed by Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan. This is the original robber baron old boys club, and E.H. Harriman was the guy who started it.
And then, of course, we see him all over Latin America. We see him all over Europe. He was part of the Bolshevik Revolution. After that, going to do the railroads over there. He's in everything.
Yeah, he's got Became by age 50 in 1898. He's director of Union Pacific. 1981 becomes the president of Southern Pacific Railroad. By the time of his death, he controlled Union Pacific, Southern Pacific, San Jose, and Grand Island Railroad. St. Joseph and Grand Island. That's some of the South America stuff you talked about. Interesting quote. He owned the Illinois Central Railroad. There's a guy by the name of James Stillman, who was the head of National City Bank, which of course became Citibank. He says, talking about Harriman, he goes, he was not a safe man to do business with, yet the Illinois Central was one of the best run and most profitable in the country. But I love that, not a safe man to do business with.
Right. Well, and can I add something that I found after yesterday when you were giving me the names? One of the connections that I'd made way back, that the whole thing about these families, as I've said to you, fascinates me. So one of the most fascinating families that I've ever come across during these couple of years of research and all this stuff was before unknown to me, the Rumsey family in Buffalo, New York. Well, one of his kids marries a Rumsey. So his daughter, Mary Harriman, marries a Rumsey. And Rumsey, for those of you who don't know, was one of the wealthiest families in the United States back in the day. And they're from Buffalo. They literally owned like almost half of the real estate in Buffalo proper. They owned everything. They owned everybody. They built this train station there that rivaled Grand Union Station in DC and New York. And the connection for me is while Bill Donovan married, I think her first name was Ruth Rumsey, and this Mary Harriman married, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, it was her brother. So these people are all related to Wild Bill Donovan.
Would it shock you to know that there was a David Rumsey who was a Skull and Bones alumni in 1966?
No, it wouldn't, because that is like, they are one of the blue blood families of the Northeast.
Do you know who else was Skull and Bones class in 1966?
No.
John Forbes Carey.
There you go.
Fun stuff. Good connections there. All right, getting back to Mr. E.H. Harriman. He was involved in a lot of steamships. You know, we've talked about a lot of these great American fortunes that are built in shipping. Harriman couldn't miss out on that.
And slave shipping.
Quite a bit. And, of course, opium smuggling and all kinds of things like that. And eventually, cocaine.
And then you've got Wild Bill Donovan setting up the whole market with the soon-to-be OSS and CIA. Imagine that.
And, of course, he hired the Dulles brothers, who are the lawyers for Brown Brothers Harriman, which is the Harriman family we're talking about.
Exactly.
All right, so what did I say? Oh, here's another fun connection for him. Big investor in the Wells Fargo Express Company. This is back in the 1800s. Thing to remember about Wells Fargo is they were not a Wall Street bank. They were like based out of something like North Dakota or something like that to this day, which gives them some kind of favorable tax treatment. But Wells Fargo was designed to be a bank for the West because of the California Gold Rush. And it was an express company as well, because it was also Pony Express. They took over the Pony Express like the last 2,700 miles. And that was pretty good money back then. It was called the Butterfield Overland Route. And that's basically when the country was moving west. Wells Fargo was in the banking part of it and in the mail part of it. And Mr. Harriman was in there as well. And of course, when there were the railroads, that was just a perfect combination.
And they are also very well known for being a spy agency. That they used the access to all parts unknown to bring back information that was vital to the Harrimans in order to conduct their business. They were like the Advon of the OSS and then the CIA.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much resistance there was from the railroad people to the building of the Panama Canal. Was there, was it, cutting into our, but we see Bonesman on both ends as, involved in both trades. So it's, it's almost Hegelian.
I don't think so, because as far as the resistance question goes, because I think what you find is that it sped up their money-making machine, because they already had railroads in all of Latin America, right? They had already built railroads in Nicaragua. They had railroads in all of their, just from the ports to the product, right? So having the ability to pick up bananas or, whatever it is out of the Caribbean, rum or whatever, and run through the canal and drop it off at another railroad point on the other side of the Mexico or the western part of the United States, just sped up their money transactions.
Yeah, it's interesting. I talked about that little cartel group that started the whole robber barons. You think about this, whether it be shipping or whether it be railroad, which were the two main, where most of the fortunes were made. You had Rockefeller, who had the monopoly. He owned 70% of America's oil. You had Carnegie, who had a monopoly in steel. J.P. Morgan handled the financing, the stock market. He did the underwriting for all of these different railroads. They just had they cornered the entire market with just this handful of people.
Correct.
Those are your robber barons. Okay, well that's E.H. Harriman. He then dies, unless you have anything more on him.
No.
Okay. He dies and leaves an estate estimated to be worth about $200 million at the time. That's about $7 billion in today's money. He left it all to his wife, and she passed away shortly thereafter, and the money would be distributed to the children, most of them going to Avery Harriman and his youngest brother, E. Roland Harriman. So I'm going to do just a quick dive into E. Roland Harriman before we get into Avery. His name is E. Roland Harriman, Bonesman, class of 1917, so 4 years after his brother. Funny, his nickname was Bunny. Yeah, Bunny. It's not a name I'd want to have follow me around my whole life. He gets out of college, 1917, World War War's going on, so of course he joins the Army. He's a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Ordnance Department. He would catch pneumonia and influenza and get honorably discharged in 1919, but he did serve. So then he joins something called the Merchant Shipbuilding Corporation that his brother had an interest in, his older brother. By 2022, he would join W.A. Harriman Company, where they were investment bankers, and then they would co-found Harriman Brothers and Company. So the two brothers have that. In 1931, they merge with the Brown Brothers to form Brown Brothers Harriman, and that is a private bank that is around to this very day. I have bumped into them a few times, but they manage the money of the very, very wealthy. Let me see if I have some of the clients here. The main customers for Brown Brothers Harriman. Just the Rockefeller family, the Ford family, the Carnegie Foundation, Yale, Harvard. Just run-of-the-mill wealthy people. So that's Brown Brothers Harriman, and we're going to get into why Brown Brothers Harriman is so important. But let me talk a little bit more about E. Roland.
So I find it interesting that is a bank that's basically a private bank, not part of the FDIC or anything like that. And they manage all of the foundations that fund the CIA. Yeah.
And it's interesting. A lot of this has to do with a lot of things changed with the Glass-Steagall Act in 1934, which made commercial and banks and investment banks had to separate their businesses. And you'll see that a lot when we talk about these banks. They had to split into two. One fun thing about E. Roland Harriman, he worked for the firm. He didn't do anything spectacular. He was also the chairman of the board for Union Pacific Railroad. Of course, inherited the shares from his father. But after World War II, he becomes a member of the Board of Governors and then the president of the American Red Cross.
Okay, so Illini is in the comments. He's my finance guy, And well, one of them. And he says that Brown brother Harriman today does most custody work. They're very close to a State Street type entity, and they no longer do investment banking.
I've seen their name on underwriting documents a few times and some private placements. They're still involved to some degree, but we can check that. I don't have a Bloomberg terminal on my desk anymore, thank goodness. So I don't have
I think mine still does. But anyway, okay. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I actually did a search to see what Brown Brothers Harriman is up to these days. If there was anything notable, and they're pretty private, but there are filings.
I just think it's very interesting of who they took care of.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to jump into for a little bit because it's important. But the Red Cross part, you didn't get a kick out of that?
I did, because for those of you who don't know, Red Cross has always, from its beginning, been a cover for intelligence work. The Harriman, as I mentioned before, had the dad had used it as a cover for a trip to Russia. And what they did was they would go into under the pretense that they're doing charity work or whatever, and then they would send. So in this particular one, they sent like 5 doctors out of 30. So the other 25 were basically spies. And they were businessmen. I mean, wealthy, like New York businessmen. And they farmed out and did all of the intelligence work under the guise of Red Cross, and then brought back all of that information, and they make their decisions based on that. And this has been done for the entire existence of the Red Cross. Very much so. And they popped up in our storyline, from week to week. it's just there. But it's interesting that, people that are, sitting at the big boy table in the stuffy rooms of the private clubs are involved so often in the Red Cross. Yes. And I actually met Elizabeth Dole when she was the president of the Red Cross. She came to northern Iraq while I was deployed there. And I got assigned as her escort officer because, of course, it was just logical that I do that. Because of the facilities and how things were set up. I was the only female at the time for deployed there. So very interesting. All right, into Brown Brothers Harriman. And then we'll finish up talking about Averill. All right, so Brown Brothers Harriman is considered a private investment bank. The merger was in 1931. The Brown Brothers part of it's interesting. It comes from the Brown family, shockingly. The patriarch of that family is a guy named Alexander Brown, who immigrated to Baltimore in 1800, and he made his money in shipping Irish linen. Apparently, that was high quality. He had 4 sons that would all form different firms. All these firms would eventually merge into one. One son ended up going over to England and forming Brown Shipley and Company, which did, I think, more shipping than it did banking, but the two cross paths, and they would work with the Brown Brothers off and on over the decades. Brown Brothers and Company finally coalesces to something called Brown Brothers and Company. Sorry, I think it comes together. Founded in 1818. I found a nice short little write-up from a guy by the name of Zachary Carabell. He's talking about Brown Brothers and Company. This is before they'd met the Harrimans. In its first 100 years, the firm helped to make paper currency standard in the United States. Kind of important. They underwrote the earliest railroad and transatlantic steamship companies and almost unilaterally created the first foreign exchange system between the American dollar and the British pound. In the 20th century, it became a cornerstone of what became known as the establishment, as its partners entered the halls of government to shape the global economic and security system that remains the world's institutional architecture. It's a pretty profound paragraph. That's crazy. Yeah.
So they get together with the Harrimans, obviously a match made in heaven. So there's 16 original founding partners. 11 of them went to Yale.
I was going to say, that's crazy. How many were Bonesman?
Great question. 8.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's not against all odds or anything.
One of them, I'm going to come back to at the very end because I want to start next week's show on the guy I'm going to come back to.
Okay.
So remind me at the end. One of those 8 Bonesmen. That'll be our mic drop moment.
Okay.
One of the other founders was a guy named Moreau Delano. And of course, that last name is the middle name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And how did the Delanos make their money?
Opium.
Yep. Boy, there's connections sure
I
happen.
think, and I want to say this because this was my mic drop moment going through the Warburg thread that I'm doing right now. What is being done to the United States right now with the flooding of opium and illegals and all of that stuff, we did to China. Not we, but primarily the UK. But we did help.
Well, let's be honest. It was the British East India Company.
Well,
it was more. Yeah, that was the foreign company.
But we were involved. So was Sweden. Sweden had an East Indies that got involved as well. And the Warburg branch of their family in Sweden was part of that whole thing. It's too, is what I'm discovering. And so not only did we flood China with drugs, like they're flooding America with drugs, then they basically surround it and begin, I just think the similarities in history are so illustrative of this hidden hand that everybody tries to pretend is not there.
Yeah, it's banking tied with drug smuggling, tied with espionage, and it's the same people. And by the way, is that the same Warburg family that Brady basically was the architect of the Federal Reserve?
Yes, that same one.
Boy, it's got to be a quinky dink.
Okay, go ahead. I got us off track.
One of the other wasn't considered a founding partner, but one of the other early members of Brown Brothers Harriman was, of course, George Herbert Walker. And Prescott Bush was certainly one of the founding partners. So the Bushes and the Walkers are part of this again. I have a fun story about this. One of their later directors, like in the 2010s, was a guy by the name of Donald Marin. And I've been in a room with Donald Marin because my very first Wall Street firm was known as Payne Weber. And he was the chairman and CEO of Payne Weber. This guy's a Army vet and just a Brooklyn street kid who worked his way to the top on Wall Street, after getting out of Vietnam. He's just a tough son of a gun. And he came and addressed the whole training class. So I didn't actually speak to him, but why he's important. Donald Marin sat there as the sole representative of Payne Weber. There were like 12 Swiss bankers working for UBS, and they negotiated the UBS Payne Weber buyout in 2000. The stock closed one day, and Marin was able to negotiate a price that was 47% higher the next day. It's one of the great deals in Wall Street history. At the time, I had only been there for about a year at Payne Weber. So my stock holdings, I think, went from about worth $1,000 to almost $1,500. But some of the 30-year vets that were in that office I was at became instant millionaires, or millionaires became multimillionaires. It was a gigantic deal when UBS bought Payne Weber. So that was a funny coincidence for me because I had some personal attachment to it.
That's
and
great.
And Marin would go on to be the run Brown Brothers Harriman later on. So Brown Brothers Harriman, the story's going to skip around a little bit, but it's important to know one of the biggest things they did is their company was working to help finance the Nazis in all kinds of ways. But the big connection was a German industrialist named Fritz Thyssen, or is it Thyssen?
I've heard it pronounced both ways.
Okay. Well, Thyssen owned United Steelworks, or I'm going to try to say this in German, Verdienst Stahlwerke AG, which is about 75% of the German steel industry. It's one guy. And he's being financed by Brown Brothers Harriman. Or the Brown Brothers Harriman is its U.S. agent. A lot of money's funneling through there. we don't have to go into detail, but there was a Dutch bank involved as well, and Prescott Bush's fingerprints are all over this. Thiessen is also a board member of the Reichsbank. He was an interesting story. He absolutely was afraid of communism, so he joined the Nazi Party. He's involved in the Night of the Long Knives, and in the early 30s, he actually supported some of the Jewish purges and fired all of his own Jewish employees. You get to 1938, and the Nazi Party is going after the Catholics. They're doing anti-Catholic purges, and he does not like that at all. So he writes a telegram to Goering opposing the invasion of Poland. Then he flees to Switzerland, gets expelled from the Nazi Party, decides he's going to move to Argentina, so he's in France when that invasion happens. He gets arrested by the Vichy French, ends up spending most of the war in a concentration camp. After the war, he gets tried for being a supporter of the Nazi Party, and he confessed that, yes, I was, until 1938. The Denazification Tribunal would later declare him a lesser offender, and he was only fined 15% of his assets, which apparently he got back after the war. But that's Thiessen, so interesting guy. But he was banking with Brown Brothers Harriman.
All right, and so let me go to the other side of that, where you have from the book American Memory Hole by Donald Jeffries. My daughter bought this for me for Christmas.
They know you.
Says that talking about the shipments of gold out of Russia post-Bolshevik Revolution. The shipments were coordinated by Jacob Schiff, Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Standard Oil and General Electric supplied the Soviet Union with $37 million of machinery. Banker and railroad magnate Averell Harriman, whom we will examine closer later in the book, came to monopolize the Soviet manganese production for over 20 years, which leads us right into World War II. So they were on both sides.
Well, yeah, it's a great business if you can do it.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who wins.
You win.
All right, so let's talk about William Avery Harriman. Born in 1891. He just died in 1986.
Which is kind of crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, it really did. I was thinking about that when I was typing out my notes. I go, this guy was actually running around still doing things when I was alive. And we're talking about pre-World War I stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's Skull and Bones, class of 1913, 4 years before his brother. His background, of course, he's the son of E.H. Harriman. At the time when he inherited his wealth, I once read that it was the biggest inheritance in United States history at the time. Grew up, went to Groton School, another one of those private, what was the term you used last week for these private matriculation schools? Then he goes on to Yale.
Like the private, like the Morton, those.
Yeah, he's definitely one of those highbrow private schools.
Yeah, I don't remember what I used to. No telling.
So the interesting thing about him, well, first of all, let's talk about his business. He's obviously a very successful investment banker with Brown Brothers Harriman, and he had owned parts of Union Pacific Railroad, Merchant Shipping Corporation, Polaroid, Southern Pacific, Central Pacific, Illinois Central, Wells Fargo, Pacific Mail Steamship and Company, America Ship and Commerce. Here's a fun one: American Hawaiian Steamship Company. Why is that interesting? Well, because some of our plot members helped overthrow Hawaii. He's part of United American Lines. Okay, these next two actually matter. Guarantee Trust Company and Union Banking Corporation. Union Banking Corporation it's now defunct, but it was a big deal back in, I'd say, the 30s through the 70s, or 60s, I guess. And that's William Avery. So he had his fingers in a lot of pies. Being as successful as he was, he became a key policy advisor to Democrats. So FDR and him become friends. they're in the middle of the Great Depression. And Averell Harriman, I think it was 1932, joins what's called the National Recovery Administration. Now, everything that the government threw at the Great Depression failed. And Averell Harriman was part of that. He's also part of the Business Advisory Council. So being real close friends with FDR, he gets sent to England as FDR's personal envoy to the United Kingdom and became very good personal friends with Winston Churchill. You're going to find all kinds of these conferences regarding World War II that Harriman was the U.S. envoy, and he was traveling with Churchill almost the entire time. Yeah. He's there at the Atlantic Conference with Churchill, where they established the British and American goals for post-World War II, and this is before the U.S. was even involved in the war. Harriman's the guy who pushed for U.S. aid to Russia when they were fighting the Germans. He also would accompany Churchill to the Moscow Conference, where basically Stalin chewed out Churchill and FDR, though not to his face, for why don't you have boots on the ground in Europe? The British were fighting in North Africa, and they hadn't really put boots on the ground in Europe. And so the Soviets at the time were taking an awful lot of the brunt of the Nazi assault.
Yeah, all of it.
Yeah. And so this guy's going toe-to-toe with Stalin at a bunch of these conferences all over the world. So interestingly enough, here he is working for the President of the United States as the U.S. envoy, and a bunch of his assets get seized in New York City under the Trading with the Enemies Act. And this goes back to Thiessen. They would seize this Union Banking Corporation assets, the Holland American Trading Corporation, something called the Seamless Steel Equipment Corporation. And he would get all of his assets back after the war. So no harm, no foul. But isn't it interesting that you get not only him, but Prescott Bush got charged under the Trading with the Enemies, and yet these people are let right back into society in the highest halls of power in America.
Yeah.
I don't think you or I would get that kind of opportunity.
No.
All right, so here's another fun one he did. So doing the wartime compensation, they pretty much tried to calculate it based on what your pre-war holdings were. And Harriman had a ton of coal reserves in Poland. So when all those wartime compensations were paid out, Harriman made millions, while a lot of regular Polish people got nothing.
You want me to tell you where his money came from in Poland?
Oh, please do.
So, you know, this book that I've been reading about, it's called A Law Unto Itself, about Sullivan and Cromwell, that we wanted to talk about.
Yep.
All right. W. Averell Harriman, then a banker, hired Sullivan and Cromwell for his pet project, financing the electrification of Poland. That's where his money in Poland came from. Harriman had agents in Poland and went there often. He didn't, and interestingly enough, it says in here that Harriman didn't necessarily like the Dulleses, but he respected their ability to get done what he needed to have done. Said that he controlled the entire electrical grid in Poland.
Here is Mr. Averell Harriman. Oh, didn't look like anything too special, but there's more to this guy. Do you want to talk more about the World War II stuff, all these conferences with Stalin and Churchill? There's some interesting anecdotes about it.
Go ahead.
I was going to say my personal favorite is when he first got to England. He's 50 years old, and he has an affair with Churchill's son's estranged wife. Churchill's son, and she's only 21 years old at the time. Yeah. Churchill's son was, I guess, apparently an alcoholic and had all kinds of issues. But of course, Churchill was an alcoholic too, so that makes perfect sense.
Well, his
Along
son was part of the MI6 crowd too. He was like a weapons dealer eventually.
Is that the same son?
Yeah.
Okay. I've got some other fun Churchill connections for you for next week.
Okay.
So remind me. An article showed up in my email. It was perfect, and I didn't think it's going to take about. I didn't think we'd have time to get to it today, so I didn't bring it with me. But bear with me 1 second. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that? I'm trying to find something real quick.
About what? Well, I found it very interesting that Harriman's present with much of overlaps with the Dulles brothers, both in their representation when they were working at the Sullivan and Cromwell, but also on the intelligence front later on and the State Department. And I just found it interesting that they were noting that he didn't necessarily like them, but he loved what they were capable of doing for him. And so that they oftentimes found themselves, because they operated in the same circles, and they find themselves in, the settlements after the world wars and stuff like that, always kind of in the same circles.
Yeah, very much so. Now, here's an interesting. We just segued right into what I was going to go into next. So after the war, he is a huge supporter of George Kennan's policy of containment of Soviet Union. Now think about that 180. He had been the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He'd been pushing for helping Russia during World War II. And then he turns around and he backs Kennan's policy of containment.
Well, see, let me back up here just a second. I don't think him being the ambassador to the Soviet Union was anything about supporting the Soviet Union. That's not what ambassadors do. They're there to gather information about the inner workings of that government. And once he understands how that government operates, he then uses that information to turn it against Stalin. He knows, having sat there, and I've read extensively about this, he knows Stalin has no ambition, that he knows about the losses, tens of billions, of people dead. The Soviet Union's devastated. Everything on the Western Front got destroyed by the Germans there. And keep in mind, a lot of their war machine was on the Western Front because the Germans built it during the intervening World War I and World War II. So in order to get around the sanctions, Germany went into Soviet territory and built munition factories to ramp up production unbeknownst to everybody else, although I think a lot of people knew, but anyway. So there are a ton of munition factories that once Germany and Russia or Soviet Union are at war with each other, the Russians fall in on those. That's the same area that was the Donbass region, right? So that's all of their resource materials, their war machine are in the Donbass region. And a lot of that was set up originally by Hitler. So this whole thing is fascinating when all of that's devastated, right? It's overrun, destroyed. And you've got Harriman sitting over there doing an assessment of just how devastated the Soviet Union is. He knows they're not aggressive. He knows they're not going anywhere. They can't. They don't have men and they don't have equipment. And yet he mysteriously pops out of there and goes, oh my God, they're going to overrun the world. Communism, it's the boogeyman. I look at that completely different. He went on a spying mission called an ambassador and came back and knew they were not capable of doing anything. And Kennan and him and everybody else perpetuated this. Oh my God, we've got to contain them. It's the devil dressed up as communism. And they knew that it was kind of like, what is it? Like a house built on sand. There was no there. but they made it sound imminent that it was going to just pop out all over.
Yeah, and this guy, he was all over the place in World War II with all these different conferences. They had that 1943 conference where they basically tried to redesign the League of Nations, which created the United Nations.
Yes.
That's Hull's mission. Harriman's there.
Yeah.
He's involved in the planning of Operation Overlord. There's the Tehran conference when they talked about relations with Poland and China. Basically, here's an interesting blurb. The conference highlighted, this is the Tehran Conference of 43. The conference highlighted the divisions between the United States and Britain about the post-war world. Churchill was intent on maintaining Britain's empire and carving the post-war into spheres of influence, while the United States upheld the principles of self-determination as laid out in the Atlantic Charter.
Can I gag now?
Please.
Are you kidding me?
I couldn't say that with a straight face.
No, because everybody was on the same sheet of music. They organized the post-war world map to create the strategy of tension and ensure forever chaos and the ability to generate war anywhere around the world.
Yeah, the way I've always said it is the British Empire never ended. They continued their same tactics. It's just now they had the United States to lead the way and take the blame and basically do all the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
But the British Round Table and its American counterparts are still like two peas in a pod. Yeah.
Absolutely.
The other interesting about the Tehran conference is that's where they negotiated with Russia. It says, look, if Germany's defeated, Soviet Union will then attack Japan to help us with a war in the Pacific, which they ended up doing to some degree. A couple other things there, and I'll go into he's at the Yalta conference. We all know all about that. It's where he's encouraging taking a stronger line with the Soviet Union. Go figure, especially on Poland. Now, why would he be so interested in Poland?
Now you know.
Uh-huh. There was like one or two other blurbs I didn't get a chance to type out. Yeah, that should be good for him for his wartime. I think we've made the case that this guy was all over the place in World War II, and it is one of the architects for everything we see in the post-World War II world. Gabriel Harriman had a part of it.
Yeah.
And it continues what he does after that. So in 1950, where is this? Make sure I get the year right. He runs for governor of New York in 1954, and he wins. He would then lose. I'm sorry, he's the Democrat governor of New York in 1954. That he would lose to Republican Nelson Rockefeller in 1958.
And they're really two peas in a pod. I mean, I think it's funny that they actually pretend like they're on different sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, but isn't that like the best example we could ever give for how right versus left is just a distraction?
Correct.
And then and it's just we get so caught up in our tribalist Republican versus Democrat, and these guys don't really care which one it is because
it's all a mirage.
They're drinking whiskey at the same club and smoking cigars.
120 Broadway.
The reason Abel Harrison had some pretty big aspirations. He wanted the Democrat nomination for president, and he tried to get it in both 1952 and 56. But both times he lost to in the Democratic convention. Was that Adlai? No. Remind me who were the Democrat candidates. Anyway, Truman backed him, but it wasn't enough. So he's always been a key policy advisor for Democrat presidents. Obviously, under FDR, I talked about that a little bit. There's some JFK stuff in here. He helped implement the Marshall Plan. Under JFK, he was pushing for the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. And then under LBJ, he became deeply involved in the Vietnam War. So let's sum up what we know about him so far. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth. to one of the wealthiest families in America, goes to the finest schools, goes to Yale, gets invited into secret societies, and after that, he's basically had his finger involved in railroads, shipping, banking, espionage, trading with the enemy. Sits on all kinds of boards, becomes an American diplomat, going all over the world, meeting with Churchill, Stalin, you name it. This guy's been there. Almost became the president of the United States. Can you imagine? Would have been another Bonesman in the Oval Office.
Yeah, I don't know that he'd be any worse than Bush Sr., but anyway, point well taken.
I should have started with this one. What he's really known for is he's the founder of Sun Valley, Idaho.
Oh, and I did want to point out to people, when you mentioned China earlier, you're not really talking about China. You're talking about Xi'an China pretending to be in charge of China.
Yeah, I'm trying to think the year. That's correct. not CCP.
Yeah, but even not Mao. I mean, even before the Communist Party was, really full up and running. And that was a mistake that I made. And I think it's on purpose that they do that to us. You have in your brain that you're talking about mainland China, and none of these people even recognized it. They only brought Chiang out, even though he was an opium warlord for all practical purposes. But he was their opium warlord.
All right. So do you want to talk about his involvement in the Vietnam War? Have we done that before? I didn't do a deep dive here on that part of it. I know he's got his fingerprints all over the place, but I thought you might have some more of that.
Well, one of the things that I thought was one of the most interesting ones, and I had read it in, I think it's the American Memory Hole book, but there is a mention of it in Wikipedia, and that was in just after World War II, where you have Harriman adopted the Secretary of Defense's Forrestal after he committed suicide, adopted his son.
Yeah.
That blew me away.
Yeah, he actually paid for him to go to Harvard Law.
Yeah. So he becomes his protege, which kind of is creepy. I mean, actually, but whatever. Do
you have Forrestal down as a good actor?
I don't know. When I first heard the whole thing, I thought he was, but he really is a part of this whole thing. If you actually look back at where he was in the late mid 30s, late 30s, he's part of almost like a William Donovan kind of society. He's not obviously a blue blood, but he is not a normal person either.
The way I think about it, people like you who served on military bases, or someone like myself who grew up on a military base, you understand there's these officer clubs where not everybody can get into. And imagine when you get to DC, those officer clubs of the flag level type people, they start mixing with the muckety mucks in business world and politics. And these are the people you're having conversations with, and you know what they're talking about. So I think it'd be very easy for it'd be very difficult for a guy like Forrestal, if he was a total straight shooter, to have survived in that DC element. The politicization of the military is pretty rampant, to say the least. And I think my understanding, it probably has been at least since World War II.
Oh, well, I mean, the whole creation of the civilian, quote unquote, the civilian oversight. And I understand why people think that's so important. It corrupted a corruptible organization by doing that. Because you have the military industrial complex, which was created at exactly the same time, right? So now you have the civilians that are supposedly civilians, when all they really are is military industrial complex people in charge of the warfighters. You don't have warfighters in charge of warfighters. Your civilian control of the military occurs at the president's level. Having a 4-star general working for the president and basically taking what is the joint staff and moving it over here as a command and control element, and you have the services supplying the joint chiefs of staff which the COCOMs all report to, gives you a warfighter reporting to the civilian in charge, which is the commander-in-chief. By adding this entire level, and not just the SecDef, there's thousands and thousands of civilians at the Pentagon that are basically politically associated and embedded into the DC infrastructure that corrupts every element that goes below that. It is one of the worst things I think that was ever done, and no one will talk about it because they look at you when you say that as if you just beamed in from Mars. But it is literally one of the worst things. When you had the War Department and you had a general up there whose responsibility was the welfare of all of the men and women of the military below him, there was a lot less, I'm not saying there wasn't any, there was a lot less politicalization of the military itself.
Yeah, that's when we were talking about that a couple of weeks ago. That's what Pete Hegseth has to take on. And that's a very entrenched, I guess, aristocracy or whatever you want to call it. But it's going to be Pete Hegseth has his work cut out for him. And apparently he's going to get the nomination. I guess Fetterman gave his vote. So
to me, the best thing he could do is fire every 3- and 4-star general there is right off the bat. I would consider firing most of the 2-stars. But if he could find a army of what they refer to as iron colonels, all of the colonels, I'm not one of them, but all of the colonels that were passed over for their star because they were outspoken and bold, and you put every single one of them either back on active duty if they're fit to serve or appointed as a civilian, because a couple of reasons. They're pissed off that they fucked with our military. They're pissed off that they did well, first of all, they're pissed off that they weren't, their independence and brains were not enough to get them promoted to their 1st star, right? Because they weren't playing the game. So you already have these guys that has this vendetta, and then and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a good way. They're motivated to make the change because they got screwed by the system. And that's exactly what Trump has been doing. If you notice, like putting people in, like what's her face in the intelligence that got put on the Quad S, right? So everybody that's been victimized by this system is now in a position to fix it. The guys, Lohmeyer and the other guy that just got put in as the cabinet level on the SecDef's staff or in the Air Force, whatever. So all of those people that were victimized by the system, the iron colonels are an entire cadre. And what I mean by iron colonels is you are allowed to stay 30 years as a commissioned officer unless you are promoted to your 1st star, and then you get some extra time. And they tenure out at the 30-year level, having never been selected for their 1st star. And there are all of in my opinion, and I got medically disqualified the year before my first GO board met, so I don't know whether I would have ever made it or not. So again, I only had 22 years commissioned service, which I was a very young colonel. So nowhere near being an iron colonel. I'm not saying this because it applies to me, but I worked with a lot of them. They were brilliant. They are the people that are, no kidding, the smart guys in the room, but they won't keep their mouth shut either. They're very bold and they don't suck up to people. And my advice, if I was giving them any, is go find every one of them that will go back on active duty or serve as a civilian and make that your front line.
Well, if they're going to do all those firings of the stars, I hope and I think they would strip their security clearance as well.
Oh, they have to.
Okay. Good stuff. I didn't realize we were going to get into that today, but that's cool. A couple more things on Averill. So LBJ loses the election in 68, or actually steps down, doesn't even run in 68, and he's out of office. and with him, Averell Harriman leaves too. He's certainly not going to work with a Republican, heaven forbid. So what does he do in 1969? Well, he joins the Council on Foreign Relations, of course, and eminently qualified. But more importantly, he joins the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome in 1969. The Club of Rome was founded in 1968. I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with them, but this is a big deal. We've talked about Thomas Malthus and his population reduction stuff. This is where all of this Great Reset came from, was Malthus. Well, Club of Rome reignited it, and they came out with a report where Harriman was very intimately involved in, was called the Limits to Growth Report of 1972. And the quote from that is, "The computer simulations suggest that growth of production and consumption could not continue due to resource depletion or pollution." Now, that is very similar to what Malthus was saying, a couple hundred years ago. And I actually got the chart.
And when you're done with this part, are you going to talk about the Pilgrim Society that he was a member of?
I have not done deep dive on Pilgrim Society, and I saw Renee in the chat.
Yeah, we talked about it because the Pilgrim Society has to do with Operation Gladio too. So I'll say a couple words about that. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you pull this up on the screen?
Sure.
This is the Malthusian catastrophe. This is basically scarce resource theory. And as we know, the rulers of the realm have always said wanted to grab all the world's resources for themselves. This is what mercantilism was at its core. We still live under a new version of mercantilism today. But it basically says the production of food will only go up linearly, whereas the population growth is going to go up exponentially. And at one point in time, we have a crossover where there's war, famine, disease. So the obvious solution to that, of course, is hoard the resources and population control. And this is where you get things like you hear things like the World Economic Forum talking about wiping out 90% of the population. It's all based on this, and this is exactly what the Club of Rome said in their report.
Okay, so let me also put that back up there for just a second.
Yep.
Because I now have a completely different, and I understand everything and agree with everything that you just said. But I think this area right here in the middle, we have war. They create the famine and they create the disease to keep us right there at that pivot point.
Well, the other interesting is that they've always neglected.
That's Operation Gladio, by the way.
Yeah,
that intersection, you can draw a little circle around it, and that's Operation Gladio. It's creating the wars, creating the famines, and creating the disease.
Where I think it's what they completely miss out on is the concept of human ingenuity. We have always found ways of being able to feed our society as it grows. We just get smarter.
And we know that. They don't want us to know that because they want control. That diagram to me always represented, when I first came across that at the beginning, when I was doing the Anthony Sutton deep dive, I was like, oh, that looks weird. Because you think about it, with communism, which we know they paid for, created all the famine. And they tell us constantly about, communism is bad because they starve their people to death. They literally, COVID, kills millions. They literally did everything at that intersection to keep us right there.
So I think the timing of that 1968 Club of Rome founding and the 1972 report is fascinating, because right around that same time, some other major events are going on. And I've talked about this before, but I want to hammer this point home. Between like 1971 and 1973, Rockefeller disciple Kissinger goes over to China to open it up to the West. George Bush would be our first delegate there, coincidentally, Skull and Bones.
Coincidentally, CIA.
Yeah. You had Maurice Strong, who is a Rockefeller disciple, goes to the United Nations and starts all of the climate alarmism. Remember, climate alarm is about scarce resources as well. It's about peak oil. Peak oil was invented by John David Rockefeller in the 1870s to drive up the price of oil. Same game. Klaus Schwab, another one of the Rockefeller stooges, in 1971 found the World Economic Forum, who has pushed the Great Reset for the last 54 years now. All this stuff happened in a 5-year period and all floats downhill from the Rockefeller, while you've got Harriman sitting on the Club of Rome giving the scientific backing for all these things. Yep. People, this is the greatest scam ever perpetuated on the human race, and they're doing it for all the marbles. They are trying to basically create the world's biggest plutocracy, and it's not an American thing. It's not a British thing. It is of the ruling class, these bloodlines all over the world.
All over.
You can find them in every country. Some of the players at different levels. That is the game plan, and I don't know how to say it any more succinctly to that unless you want to add to it. But that is what is going on in that 5-year period of late 60s, early 70s. All put in place.
And again, this is where you have Richard Nixon taking over from LBJ and taking us off the gold standard, and the entire discombobulation of everything that we had known in order for them to be able to manipulate everything going forward, because they have to have the freedom to manipulate it in order for their, Great Reset or whatever to work.
Excellent. That's all I have on Harriman today. You want to talk about pilgrims?
Well, I just want to go over a little bit, because I want, just like what you were just talking about, if you look at the first people, of course, it's a British thing. It basically is the intro to every U.S. ambassador into the, it's like a ritualistic introduction of the U.S. ambassador into the U.K. The guy that runs the whole thing is King Charles. And you have all of these, royal blue bloods that are on the staff. And it says, over the years, the elite membership has included Henry Kissinger, Margaret Thatcher, Caspar Weinberger, Henry Luce, Douglas Fairbanks, Lord Carrington, Alexander Haig, Paul Volcker, Thomas Keane, George Shultz, Walter Cronkite, blah, blah, blah. Lots of those kind of people, right? So you also have all of the original families of the Astors, DuPonts, Rockefellers, Carnegies, Morgans, Vanderbilts, all part of this. They talk about the fraternity and sororities of Yale and Harvard, and their match in England is Oxford and Cambridge. So this is a society of pilgrims, referring to us and the UK's as if we're in that same, because how the UK thinks it's pilgrims, I don't know. But anyway, it's the matching of Yale and Harvard alums with Oxford and Cambridge, which we know are kind of like two peas in a pod. But for those of you following my Warburg thing, it also talks about, in 1921, allies of the Pilgrim Society families, Morgan, Warburg, and Rockefeller, founded the Council on Foreign Relations. And so you can see that all of the same people, these are just layers of their interactions with each other, so that they can have the ability to meet and not have people think about it. So one of the other things it says, many Americans and British pilgrims supported the appeasement policy of Hitler Germany and sympathized with the idea of fascism in favor of it versus communism. So these are just another follow-on to the Fabian Society and all of those other, it says notable members: Queen Elizabeth II, Dean Atkinson, Nelson Aldrich, Winthrop Aldrich, I already mentioned Astors, Brzezinski, Prescott Bush, Andrew Carnegie. Let's see.
Well, let's hold that. I've been thinking that we'd probably get to Pilgrim Society as part of this series and do a full deep dive on it.
Yeah. So I just wanted to go through to Donald Rumsfeld. So all of the people, Elihu Root, all of the people that we have talked about, a bunch of the Warburgs are in it. James Woolsey, a lot of CIA guys. So just so that you can get a flavor of the Harrimans were part of that venture too.
Yeah, we should definitely make that part one of the probably a chapter or two of the series, because I've obviously run into them all the time, stuff like that. I just haven't done the deep dive yet. Now I've got an excuse to do it. So thank you for the homework assignment.
You're welcome. Thanks, Renee, for reminding me.
All right. So earlier in the show, you were asking about how many Bonesmen were of the founding partners of Brown Brothers Harriman, and I told you there were 8. And there's one in particular that I did not mention because he's going to be the star of our show next week. And it's a name you know and love. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be talking about founding partner of Brown Brothers Harriman, Robert A. Lovett, Bonesman.
Oh, definitely a favorite.
Yes. So as I said, Lovett might be a show in and of itself, because there's some. I mean, because we have to go Golden Lily. We got to do all of it with him. So I think that's the plan for next week.
Challenge accepted.
Excellent.
And Golden Lily is one of my favorite topics. So
yeah, I remember the first time we talked about it, and you came back to me about 2-3 weeks later and said, "Holy sh!"
And then you stood me up. You gave me an assignment, and I gave you an assignment. I did my assignment.
Which one was mine?
I don't remember.
Boy, I tell you, I'm a bad student. Oh well.
Oh, we never did do the show either. I just went off and did my own podcast and did the book review of the book you recommended that I read, and it blew my socks off.
It was good. Golden Lily's great. So I know you'll be prepared for Lovett next week, but there's more about him than just that.
And so everybody knows that was like the second time I ever talked to Brady in my life. We just hit it off, and he was like, yeah, if you think that's because we were talking about Operation Gladio. When I did my Operation Gladio 101, the very first one I ever did, I did with War Hamster. And he was like, yeah, he says, this fits right into Golden Lily. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And I, again, right off and running. And he was part of my discovery process. So he gave me my homework. So now I'm giving him his. Yeah,
well, we learned from each other. And we learned from a lot of our great supporters on our channels, because there's way too much for any one person to discover all on its own. So this is great. This is crowdsourcing at its finest. And,
absolutely.
A lot of people that are, help you and me behind the scenes, and also publicly on Twitter, X, and all these, spaces and all that. So I appreciate the whole community, and it's a lot of fun, and I'm just, it's kind of cool to be part of.
Okay, and I want to close the show with just this. You guys know, if you've been following me, that we still have 2 of my neighbors, family members in the that are being held as hostages at this point in the DC jail. And the prosecutors in DC, along with Mayor Bowser, is still holding on to the 2 and refuses to let them out. So please keep them in your prayers. Olivia Pollock and Joey Hutchinson. Please keep them in your prayers, along with all the rest of them. Those 2 are just part of a family that I grew up with, and I am keeping tabs with my neighbor on an hourly basis as to what's going on with them. So.
Interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Pray for anybody's left there. I think I said it on X the other day that they need to investigate the entire DC Gulag complex, because you do not treat American prisoners like that.
They need to close it. DC has no reason to have a jail. This is the Phoenix program. The District of Washington has no business with a jail.
It has no business having a district court in the first place.
No,
that can be divided. Yes, it had no. I mean, that needs to go, because we've lost the ability to hold politicians accountable, because the DC system is so broken. You cannot get a fair jury there. Correct. It is impossible.
Correct.
I was someone I've known casually online for a few years at various sites, including Patriots.win, which is my true home. Reached out to me this week. He's a J6er, and he has some audio tape that has never been released, and some of his own footage. And I'm probably going to have, I'm not sure I can use all of the audio tapes because of where it came from legally. There's copyright issues, and I'm talking to a lawyer friend about it right now. But either way, I think I'm going to have him on my show next week. And then I've got a number of other J6ers that I'd like to have on as well, people that I know from Southern California. But if you know anybody else who'd be a good interview, and not the people that are out there in the front lines, everyone knows Jake Lang. He's made all the rounds and all the shows, but there's a lot of compelling stories there. So I'm going to be doing some of that work in the near future.
So we're going to have one on Sunday. And I'll get more information out today on that. And then, of course, as soon as these guys get home, I've already talked to their aunt, who is a girlfriend of mine, that we definitely want to have them on. I want Brian to have them on his show so that we can get their story out, because their story is horrific in every sense of the word. It's horrific.
The guy who I was talking about didn't have that bad of a story, but he's got a story to get out there, because he's able to tell the tale of how basically the nonviolent side of J6 was, because he's got that footage, where the cops were taking pictures and ushering people in and out. He was there on that part of it, and he's got some evidence of that the public hasn't seen, and he wants to get his story out. So I absolutely will introduce him to you after I do the show with him.
Cool.
So, yeah.
All right.
We got our hands full. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here. And we'll see you guys next Thursday at noon. Take care.
Cheers, everyone.